Good afternoon and good evening, depending on where you are. My name is Young Rae-hyun. I am the moderator of this session in Korea and the USA. It is truly my pleasure and my honor to moderate this outstanding panel with four highly respected scholars. Let me introduce each scholar in the order of presentation. The first one will be Dr. Hart, Dr. Dennis Hart. He is currently a CEO and founder of Optimus International Educational Consulting. But among his outstanding accomplishment, he was associate vice president in global engagement at the University of Texas and also at University of St. Thomas. Before he took the administrative career, he was an accomplished Koreanist, and his most known book, From Tradition and to Consumption, was awarded a Book of the Year award by Korean National Academy of Science. Next. Dr. Piotr Ostashevsky. Dr. Ostashevsky also has a outstanding career both as a scholar and in politics. He was born and educated in Poland. He received his degrees from University of Warsaw, but he also served as a visiting professor at U.S. universities. He he was appointed as an ambassador to South Korea, Polish ambassador to South Korea in 2017. He is known to speak outstanding English, Italian, and German, aside from Polish, of course. The third presenter for us is Dr. Kim Shin-gyu 선생님. Dr. Kim received her degree in political science from 외국어대학교, 한국 University of Foreign Studies. He is currently a senior researcher at Eastern European and Balkan Institute. He was also a visiting professor, a research professor in international area studies at Seug Hong University. Before then, he also stayed here in the Balkan Institute as a research professor. He has been an incredibly productive scholar. Aside from many articles, he published 3 books on Central and Eastern Europe as well. Dr. Seug Hong, Dr. Hong Seug 교수님 is a well-known professor in Ukrainian language, and he is also from Korea University of Foreign Studies, but he received his final degree from University of Alberta in Ukrainian folklore. And I just found out that University of Alberta is the world's best program in Ukrainian folklore. And he has published numerous articles and books. And some of the well-known book was, aside from the language textbook, he wrote a book titled Ukraina, the country of Kozak and the Orange Revolution. Okay, with this introduction, I will invite our first speaker, Dr. Dennis Hart, to present his paper. And when you have 5 minutes left, I will hold up this. And 1 minute left, this. Okay, please begin. I will turn on.
Good evening or good morning, everybody. Thank you all for attending this session and for being here. I'm going to show a PowerPoint, and I hope that my technology skills hold up here. Let's see, we share. Can you all see that?
Yes, I can.
Okay, then good. Then I'll begin. The title of my presentation is The Politics of Land, Land Reform and Early State Legitimacy in the DPRK and East in Europe. What I plan to do is to build upon what Professor Connelly did, which is that just as Poland and Hungary provide us with a better understanding of illiberalism in politics in other world locations, so too does the land reform that took place in North Korea in 1946 provide us with a better understanding of similar events in state legitimacy in Eastern Europe. So a key point will be examine the ties between popular legitimacy and land reform. But first, thank you to the East European and Balkan Institute for having me here today. Second, thank you to Professor Tae-yeon for organizing the conference. I realize how difficult it is to do this, and he's done a wonderful job. Thank you, Professor Om. And finally, thank you all for attending. So let us begin. I'll look at land reform in a country whose people have a history of nationalist resistance to foreign occupiers, a country that was liberated by different foreigners, a country that underwent Soviet occupation, and a country that had a new government needed to establish legitimacy among its citizens. That description fits North Korea, but it fits almost every country in Eastern Europe as well. The point of this analysis is not just to say they were the same as North Korea, but rather to help them understand one another, to see Eastern Europe through new eyes and through the events that took place in North Korea. North Korea conducted what is considered to be the most efficient, rapid, and bloodless land reform in world history. Eastern European countries did not. This comparative analysis will help us understand new understandings in these areas as to why one could, but another could not. So, background. Korea up until 1946. From 1910 to 1945, most of my audience tonight who are from Korea understand this. They suffered under a terrible Japanese colonial rule. Korean language, religion, dress, hairstyles, names were repressed or forbidden. The Japanese tried to make the Koreans culturally extinct. From 1910 to 1918, as part of this imperialist occupation, the Japanese government did a land reform. And what it did is it changed old forms of land ownership over to new forms. And as one result, the Japanese ownership of land in Korea went from 3% in 1910 to 27% by 1942. Another event that took place is a class of collaborators arose within Korea. These are the Koreans who, instead of staying with the nation, became a collaborator and sided with the Japanese occupiers of Korea. All of this has significance for Korea and land reform. So, in 1945, 70% of Koreans lived on the land. Very similar to Eastern Europe. Albania was 80%, Yugoslav 76%, Bulgaria 75%, Romania 72%, Greece only 46%. But the idea was most Koreans were peasants. In North Korea, 74% of them were peasants. But the thing to keep in mind is that the land ownership was very unequal. 6.8% of the farmers held 74% of the land in North Korea. 56.7% of the farmers owned 5% of the land. And of those people who were on the land, the Koreans, who were the peasants, they paid 50 to 70% of their harvest every year as rent. Being a Korean peasant in 1945 was not a fun occupation. It was a very hard life. But then liberation came, and it came in two forms. On August 8th, as you can see in the picture on the left, the Soviet army marched into North Korea to accept the Japanese surrender. And on the right, on September 9th, the Americans marched in to Seoul and liberated Korea from the south, while the Russians did it in the north. This set in place two different political and economic and philosophical systems which gave birth to the Koreas we still have today. Now then, why? Why did they have a massive land reform, the most successful in history in North Korea? because it started in 1946 and it was the most bloodless, most extensive. It was the biggest success in history, even up till today. So why did they have land reform? There were three major reasons for the land reform in North Korea. First, if you look at Eastern European and North Korea, you can see they all suffered from foreign occupation that tried to change their national identity. However, in the North, they were liberated, as it was Eastern Europe, by the Soviet army. And all of them, Eastern Europe and Korea, had forms of communist governments that were approved by the Soviets. So it looks as if they're very similar. It looks as if they should be very similar in how they have land reform, but actually they turn out to be different in many ways as well. Let's see, can I make this bigger? Can you see that better? Ah, good. I didn't know it was small. My apologies. So, why did the North have land reform? Three big reasons. One, ideology. The Korean independence fighters who were fighting the Japanese in China and Manchuria were inspired by communism and its anti-imperialist rhetoric. And in particular, they were impressed with the Chinese communists. They worked and they fought with the Chinese Communist Army. The Korean fighters, you can see them in the picture, fought with the Chinese communists. Now, for the Chinese communists, they were very different than the Russian communists. The Russian communists believed in the Marxist idea of the proletariat leading the revolution. China under Mao Zedong believed it's the peasants, not workers, who would lead the revolution. And the key to the peasants was land. Let's face it, if you don't have land, you don't have peasants. So the focus for the Koreans was also similar to the Chinese. And as the Korean Communist Party said, Korea is a nation of peasants, and land is the problem that must be solved in order for there to be a true liberation of Korea. So the form of communism that the Koreans have is one that looked at peasants as the key, and land was essential to winning the support of the peasants. Next, Korean communism was rooted in nationalism, similar to what Professor Connelly said. Kim Il-sung, who's the very young person down there, he has said the ultimate goal of liberating Korea is, or the ultimate objective is liberating Korea, not communism, but communism is a tool to liberate Korea. Communism was not seen as a global or class-based ideology. What made it popular in Korea was its anti-imperialist arguments, and this gave justification to explain why the Japanese were there as capitalists and imperialists, and that communism would lead the fight to restore the nation. Japan was stealing Korean land, and thereby stealing the Korean nation. To restore Korean land to Koreans was to restore Korea nation to the Korean people. Communism gave them an ideology, but it was nationalism that really was important to the Korean communist movement. So, next, another point as to why land was important had to be that in 1945, Korea was one nation, but it had two governing bodies, guided by two ideologies: communism in the north, capitalism in the south. The Soviets occupied the north, the Americans occupied the south. What this meant is that each side had to compete to be the legitimate government of Korea. You have one people, but two governments. Which one is legitimate? Which one is not legitimate is a difficult ideological battle. What the North Koreans did is they decided that by instituting a land reform in 1946, they would show themselves as different than the Southern leaders. In the North, when they conducted a land reform, they threw the Japanese off the land, and they put collaborators in jail, and they took land away from the landlords who had been friendly to the Japanese. In contrast to this, in the South, the American-sponsored government accepted the North Korean landlords and collaborators who ran away. The collaborators in the North did not want to go to jail, so they ran away to South Korea. And the South Korean government under Lee Sung-man accepted them. In the North, this was a propaganda victory. The North's land reform was a clear rejection of Japanese colonialism, a rejection of the old social system, a rejection of the old economic system. And they pointed to the South Koreans and said, look, they accept collaborators, they accept colonialism. We are the true nationalists. They are tools of foreign influence. And this was a powerful propaganda argument that the North invoked against the South. So the North was staking out the high ground and showing that they were liberating the nation from foreign imperialism, but the Southern government was not. And this became very powerful. Now then, another point as to why they pushed for the land reform was the Soviet occupation. In 1946, the Soviet generals accepted the Korean Communist Party's ideology as legitimate. They accepted that, that the Koreans would have a say in what they said. And this is a crucial point that is separate and different from Eastern Europe. The Russians in Eastern Europe kept Eastern Europe as a very high priority for their national security. Twice, Germany had invaded Russia in the 20th century. Twice, they had gone through Eastern Europe to attack Russia. Therefore, the Russian control over Eastern Europe was very complete, very tight, and they were not going to give them much space to make any decisions or very few decisions domestically. Contrast this with Korea, which is very far away from Moscow. And if the Russians were to be attacked, they would prefer that somebody attack them from Korea, not through Poland. So therefore, the Soviet generals that they sent over to Korea were more laissez-faire. They were more relaxed. They said, as long as we have a communist government, as long as we have a socialist revolution, the Koreans can run the government pretty much by themselves. So what they had was the Soviets occupied Korea, but with much more hands-off than they did in Eastern Europe. So what happened is Kim Il-sung, as the leader of the Korean Provisional People's Committee, and the Russians implemented a variety of social changes: an 8-hour workday, nationalization of heavy industry, a tax in kind, which reduced the taxes for farmers, equality of the sexes for men and women, new election codes, and land redistribution. This made the North Korean government very popular. The vast majority of people in North Korea agreed with all of these changes, but particularly land reform, because 74% of them were peasants. But what is interesting is that the Korean Provisional People's Committee, while they followed the Soviet suggestions on many points, they disagreed with the Soviet plans to centralize agriculture and to collectivize the land. In the 1930s, the Russians had gone through a bloody period where they had mass enforced collectivization, particularly in the Ukraine. Kim Il-sung and the Korean communists decided they would not do that. The Russians did not make them do it. The Russians had let them do what they wanted locally. Kim Il-sung believed that if you centralize the land, this would lead to the creation of black markets, it would lead to the creation of corruption, and it would delegitimize the new government. He argued with the Soviet generals that if they were to follow the Soviet model and to centralize, it would create bloodshed, it would create corruption, and it would make rebellion take place in North Korea. He convinced the North Koreans that they would not collectivize the agriculture, but they would redistribute the land. So the Soviets approved Kim Il-sung, but they did not handpick him as the leader. Kim Il-sung was not a puppet of the Soviet Union. Rather, he argued against them on many cases for a variety of things. He was also a great political organizer. While many Korean leaders stayed in the capital of Pyongyang in the north, Kim went out to the countryside and talked to the peasants, reasoned with the farmers, and got their support. So when the elections took place, he had the support of the farmers because he had promised them land reform, meaningful land reform. So to understand North Korea and its history, and in part you can see some similarities with certain Eastern European countries, North Korea was not a product of Soviet manipulation. North Korea was a product of an anti-colonial struggle. And this made it a very important issue as far as the Koreans. Now then, let's look at the labor reform that took place in 1946. This was very quick, and all the documents were done within less than a month. And the goal was for an agricultural system in North Korea to be based upon a farm economy that does not subject farmers to landlords while recognizing the farmers' individual ownership. Specifically, land was to be confiscated and distributed to farmers. Japanese government land, Japanese individuals, Japanese organizations, traders to the Korean people, collaborators, land owned by landlords more than 12.5 or 25 acres or ojongbo. All this land was to be taken to the state and given back to the farmers. All liabilities, debts, anything owed by the farmers was canceled. Cattle, farm tools, buildings were taken and redistributed to the farmers. Now, under the Japanese, the rent was 50 to 70% for farmers. The new government set it at 25%. So while all this was taking place in North Korea, while the farmers were getting land, while the farmers were getting redistributed wealth, while the farmers were canceling their debts, and while the farmers were paying lower rent, in the South, things were very different. In the South, what happened is that the land was confiscated from the Japanese, but instead of giving it to the peasants, the South Korean government and the Americans sold it to the South Korean peasants. So very little land reform took place. Instead, as the US government observed, most South Korean politicians took the land and used it as an opportunity for political patronage. This set the North reform as opposed to the South reform. In both North and South Korea in 1945 to 1948, the North was very popular, while the South had to put down a number of rebellions. The Americans would sell the land, but even with that process, only 28.5% of all farm families in the South owned their own land in 1948. Contrast that to North Korea, where almost all the poor farmers got land. 95% of the land taken from the Japanese and collaborators was given to poor or landless farmers. In the South, collaborators kept their land. And in the South, as a result, there was a number of rebellions in Jeju, Yosu, Gwangju, and other places had a number of rebellions against the Americans and the South Korean government. The North Koreans lacked that type of rebellions. Part of it was because they had great land reform and they incorporated the people in. Because what was clear to the Korean people of the North is the Korean Communist Party operated under the Soviet occupation, but it demonstrated that it operated for Korea to be run by Koreans to achieve Korean objectives. They avoided rapid collectivization that caused animosity and bloodshed among the people, at least until 1953, and their ideology was bound to nationalism and national identity. They weren't redistributing the land because they were communists. They were distributing the land because this was returning the nation to the people who owned it, the Korean people. Further, one element of communism that was extremely popular in the North was the egalitarianism, whereby poor peasants were accepted as members into the Korean Communist Party. In that sense, because of the egalitarianism, many of the people in the North saw the communist system and the Communist Party in the North as a very positive form of government. The reforms, the land reforms, gender reforms were popular regardless. In the eyes of most North Korean people, land reform had achieved the following goals. One, wealth was taken away from the colonial masters and given to the Korean people. Two, the landed class that had worked with the Japanese and taxed them mercilessly were done away with. Three, the Japanese land ownership system and its manufacturing economic system, which oppressed the poor peasants, was done away with. And the Korean people began to have access to political offices. As noted by the Americans, by one land reform, half the population of North Korea was given a tangible stake in the regime. And at the same time, the North Korean government gained an important propaganda weapon in its campaign against the South. In August of 1945, the majority of people in Korea were peasants. They had suffered for 35 years under Japanese occupation, and they wanted an immediate social, economic, and political revolution. They wanted a redistribution of land, and they wanted the control over their government returned to them. In
Dr. Hart,
1945 to 1950, the North
I
Korean government
apologize
delivered.
for interrupting. You're out of
One
time. Could you wrap up?
North Korean government delivered on these demands. Thank you very much. The end.
I apologize.
Not at all. I thank you for telling me the time was up.
Okay, I was holding up the sign, but it seems that you didn't see that. Next is Dr. Ostaszewski on the Poland, the transformation toward market economy after 1989 to 1991. Where are we today? Okay, Dr. Ostaszewski.
Organization this conference, I would like to talk about the transformation in my country, in Poland, 1989, 1991. Indeed, the very first period. But on the other hand, it's something like it's about my recollections, because I was just in the center of the storm at that time. And about just our transformation we have where we are today. This is the answer. Was it necessary or not? Can we skip, please? This is important to mention at the very beginning, that communism in Poland was rejected since the very beginning. Since 1945, when it was brought by the Red Army, it was unaccepted, on the other hand, by the people. But on the other hand, communism was relatively started to be a milder version since 1970, after national uprising, tremors, let's say, in Gdańsk, in the northern Poland. And since 1971, with Edward Gierek as a first secretary of the Communist Party, we were provided with the possibility to apply for passports and to travel around the world. So we knew very well how the West looked like, a liberal economy. We had different, of course, dreams about that. We thought that the transformation is just a skip very quickly, and to have immediately to earn lots of dollars, hard currency, and to be relatively well-to-do country. Indeed, that process is much slower and much harder, as we believe. What I will be talking about, of course, very briefly about the Polish economy. 1945, a Balcerowicz plan, who introduced this plan in 1989, 1990, after the first semi-democratic elections. Then there was democratic elections, and then he was the only one who indeed grasped the problem. Not always, but we can just, what I would like to emphasize, but we can just evaluate the time of that. Was it successful? Not everything is successful, but we learned from some failures. And then the Polish economy today, very, of course, briefly, because I don't want to just right now to torment you with many numbers, usually statistics. Can we skip one? No, it's backward, I mean forward. This is what we have. Centrally planned economy, as everybody knows, is ineffective. Ineffectiveness was inscribed in that. Why people wanted just to get rid of communism. But political reason is because communism was brought by the Soviet Union. The second thing is inefficiency. What does it mean? Very briefly. If you cannot buy a lavatory paper after 45 years, the end of the Second World War, this means that the system should be rejected. And the system, of course, was always, he knew very well, the representatives of the system, that they would be stuck to us. Later they changed the rhetoric, of course, that, all right, we know that we are diseased, but you have to live with us. So we give you passports, and then you can just bring a hard currency to the country. So everybody believed in the capitalist economy. Believing and dreaming is quite different to have a reality, as I mentioned. Can we skip, please? Richard Starr from Hoover Institution, the eminent scholar who wrote a book about Central Eastern Europe in 1988, describing all the countries, he emphasized that from among all the communist countries of Eastern Europe, Poland is a unique one. Why? It's not, I'm not talking about that because I represent my country and because I love my country, but why? What was the uniqueness indeed? What was behind it? Historical perception of the system imposed from Russia and the different perception of Russia. Communism was brought by Bolshevism. Bolshevism is just, usually they were perceived just as Russians, not as a system itself. Failure of collectivization of agriculture. 81% of agriculture was in private hands. Nationalization of industry was not accepted. Why? Because it was just perceived as a political crime to steal the private property from the hands and under the state control, which is inefficient. Coexistence of communism and Catholic Church. Catholic Church became since the 18th century, but 19th century and the 20th century, it was perceived as our identity, our national identity. Private sector was tolerated in about the span of 20% of national economy. Relatively free movement of people that started when I mentioned at the beginning of 70s, and transformation from agriculture industrial economy into industrial agriculture one. A change of social changes and instability of system. We had many rebellions, 1956, 1968, 1970, 1976, and 1980 through 81, that was Solidarity Movement. There was only one slogan in 1980, get out from this country, go back. We don't want you. We know that you are completely ineffective because you are like a parasite. You live with us, but we have to tolerate you. On the other hand, this is a system, communist system was based on waste, enormous waste. So the major changes which were implemented by communist system, it was of course border changes. We lost about 30% of our territory, compensated about 25% of that. It was from Germany and Eastern Prussia. But we were invaded by Germany the 1st of September 39 and 17th of September by the Soviet Union. So therefore, a border was stabilized after Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact. Collectivization of agriculture, as I mentioned, 81% land in the private hands. So it's very to oversimplify that. We had enough food. There were shortages, but the problem of transformation was how to transform flea market economy into free market economy. And that was the answer, of course. Social changes as a result of the Second World War. The Second World War deprived us 90% of upper classes. Professors were sent to concentration camps. Upper classes were decimated. Engineers, everyone was a victim because of his education. And therefore, during the Second World War, Comrade Stalin did quite the same in Eastern Poland. 25,000 Polish officers, policemen, postmen were shot dead as anti-Soviet elements. And major changes is, of course, what I mentioned before, from agriculture industrial economy to industrial agriculture economy. Of course, that was social promotion for our agriculture classes. Move them to the cities. Can we skip? Centrally planned economy. What we have, of course, is needless to say, major characteristics. Multi-sector state interventionism, existence of a cooperative ownership, private ownership relatively minor. But sometimes, even in the 70s, they used to give a green light and then to close down some entrepreneurs. But 79, 82 was growing as a private sector. Central planning office. Central planning is very important, but when you plan social demand and you don't have supply, this is the problem. What does it mean? How much people demand. But if they demand more, no way. You cannot demand more. You need one pair of shoes per year, and it's all right, we can guarantee. Of course, it causes flea market, which is much more reasonable than communist economy. And state dictatorship. This is, of course, not only that they keep up ineffective sectors of big industry, first of all. So they couldn't just follow the changes in the world. The system could exist within the system of the Soviet Union, not coexist, as Gierek tried to do, with the West. And on the other hand, that was the case of, especially in Poland, that dependency, dependent status, semi-sovereignty, as it was stated. No, unacceptable. Can we skip? The period 45-89, it is at, what we can have as just a basic data. I don't want to just read the data, but you can just compare it, what we have, the basic changes of employment in the period 49-82. What does it mean? Still, something like a decreasing number in agriculture and then skipping into heavy industry. And can we skip? All right, thank you. Major problems of centrally planned economy. What we have, economic dependence from the Soviet Union is because we're strictly connected with that market. Inefficient economic system, no respect for demand, as I said. Energy consuming economy, not responsive for global changes. High cost of production with low productivity. General waste of resources and energy, high cost of modernization. Actually, what do I mean modernization? Was unacceptable by the system because the system couldn't adapt itself to any modernization. So once we have, it's just a very brief example of that. Once we have one make of car, Fiat 126, we make it for 30 years. Because, and there was, during 80s, Jaruzelski's time, impoverished version of car. I don't know how you can understand impoverished version without a wheel, without the, I don't know, seats or whatever. International debts, because the system was based on debts. I have just a little bit of examples of that. Existence within the framework of the Soviet economic system. Dogmatism, a little bit more flexible in the 70s. And rebellions, which I mentioned. 1980, 1981, that was total collapse of the system. The system was over because solidarity movement was a trade union. How indeed it affected what the people demanded in the world. They asked the Communist Party, what does it mean that you represent the working class, the workers, and all of them joined a free trade union? So we don't have trade unions, you represent them, and they demand a trade union? So we don't have any trade unions then. This was absolutely just a collapse. 16 months. The martial law was unavoidable. We knew very well in 81 that Jaruzelski would introduce a martial law. Otherwise, that was completely just, they were driven, the car was without a driver. Because nobody had any remedy of that. We couldn't get rid of communism, of course. And we skip. This is something like what I would like to show, the plan of Leszek Balcerowicz. Situation in 1989. And it was emphasized here before that a high inflation at the beginning, 89, actually was 340% that started 1,000% at the end of the year. Uncomparable, of course, one of the best examples is usually Bolivia, 40,000% in the mid of the 60s. Shortages on the market, currency now exchangeable, two different rates, official and the black market. The US dollar is a major currency. Everybody wanted, we traded only with dollars in the free market. And stiffened salaries, high budget deficit, low standard of living. What Balcerowicz said, it is absolutely true, which means people pretend to work, the state pretends to pay them. And that was something like a theater. There's nothing real. Top priority, no system changes with high inflation. The first step, fight inflation. Of course, what did it mean? To kick the prices up, take money out from the market. And the shock therapy, Jeffrey Sachs, which later was questioned, maybe many failures of that, why it's not that should be introduced immediately and how to introduce such a plan. Balcerowicz was indeed advised by Jeffrey Sachs, but a top priority at the time was very, very high inflation. Can we skip? Economic system in 1989. If you look at just the foreign debt, that started debt, 1971, $1 billion, $41 billion in 1989. If we have an insolvent economy, we couldn't pay it back. And there were, of course, a Paris club and London club. Domination of state sector, Balcerowicz was against the state interventionism, impossible. Overmanning, especially in heavy industry. That is like a shipyard. This is one of the best examples of that. Shipyard in North Poland, Gdańsk, was the cradle of solidarity movement. But later, how to persuade the people, you are no longer needed in such a mass. Because of technical progress, modernization we expect, but on the other hand, you are no longer needed. The same, it's quite a different, the same problem existed in England with coal miners, with Margaret Thatcher, when she explained that. But your coal is not needed. There is no demand for your coal. But England had a reasonable system, so there were just some projects for a social shifts, social changes. Driving toward a market economy, we have transformation of economic system. That was a top priority through radical changes. There was no other choice. And basic purpose is preventing the rise of inflation, if it is possible, the reduction of it. Indeed, in 1992, we had a result. Reduction of budget deficit. The budget deficit grew in 1991-92. And preventing the people and companies from escape from Polish currency. Still, there was weak currency. International support for the plan. We had an International Monetary Fund, but of course we were in avant-garde just after these reforms. And a special stabilization fund for Polish economy. OECD, that helped us, and right now we're very proud, we have a candidate for Secretary General of OECD, Minister Mr. Michał Kurtyka. So after 30 years, we can indeed fly for the highest positions because we have education people. When we skip very briefly, new laws, regulations should have been introduced by the state. These are just the numbers. Stabilization program, 5 basic areas of government. The liberalization of price policy, strict control of income, stable exchange rate, liberalization of import-export policy, and restricted monetary policy. Privatization, one of the biggest things ever in transformation. After 30 years of privatization, people estimated or evaluated as one of the best experience. Young generation. For older generation, they have a mixed feelings about privatization. On the other hand, it's unavoidable. And privatization is one of the best examples of that. If you were leader after changes, you are always the most hated personality by the people. And this should be taken into account. Harsh times in 1991, I put some data here. So it's Polish economy in 1992. That was not a very immediate result of that, but we were doing much better. There was, of course, still something like instability, but foreign trade, import liberalization, tariffs roughly. Communism was based even that there was no tax system. And the taxes for the first time were introduced in 1992. People were unprepared, they didn't know how to fill out a tax report. What does it mean? I mean, I feel it. Fill out. Failures of Balcerowicz plan. Unemployment in the state sector dropped by 6%. But still, what to do with unemployed? People didn't understand the term even unemployment. What did it mean? Then, 1989, 93, unemployment rate, 3 million. It rose very quickly. And indeed, impoverishment of society, 40% of population below standards of minimum that time, at the beginning. Decline in real wages, retirement funds, rural class income. Import-export policy imbalance still. Was, of course, more balanced than during the communist time, but still is something like we imported more than exported because we had no goods to export. Inflation curbed and price increase. Indeed, that was one of the biggest diseases. I'm finishing, I know, and that's 3 minutes. So what we have, free market mechanism was launched. A balance between supply and demand, curb inflation, which I mentioned several times, budget deficit curb, opening of economy, foreign investment. So the legislation was needed, privatization, emergence of capital market, restructurization of national economy, a sustainable economic growth. What were the assets? Can we skip? Where we are. Oh, this is the result where we are today. Even if we take a structure of our GDP, before, after, you have 67% is services, industry 28%, agriculture 4.6%. That was completely different at the beginning. GDP growth per capita power purchasing is $18,000 now. Export structure, we are, of course, one of the biggest achievements is that we are member of NATO Pact 1999 and 2004 European Union. So to EU, 70%. For third world, 9%, Asia Pacific, 17%, US, Canada, 5%. Import major partners that we have, Russia, Germany, China, still is, of course, and structured commodities, whatever it is, can we skip? Where we are today, so since 1989, GDP growth at 826%. Open for foreign direct investment, structure of employment, but we have a 13% agriculture services industry, 30%, one of the lowest unemployment rate in Europe now, 5 through 6%. It's really one of the biggest achievements. Foreign direct investment, 26,000 foreign companies, and Korean investors in Poland, over 200 companies. Of course, the biggest chaebols are the supplying companies, smaller companies, all of them. So Korea became our partner. We set up diplomatic relations with Korea 1989 in November, which I'm very proud because I celebrated here the 30th anniversary of our relations. But Korean investment is still growing, which we are very happy. Successes, competitive economy, EU and NATO, shift in national economy towards services. More and more economy has been separated from politics. Relatively competitive banking system, developed credit market. Polish zloty is a hard currency right now. This is very hard currency. Conclusions. We realized completely that transformation was a must for us. Without transformation, we couldn't have survived. But our demands were completely different and beliefs in 1989. Everyone believed that it would fruit positive results after 2 or 3 years. Indeed, it took all the 90s. Then we have Barcelovic's plan was an effort to pave a way toward integration of our economy with the world. Because being integrated with the Soviet Union's economy was completely just, we cut all the ties with the West. Economic priority, of course, against social challenges. And transformation left many victims we have always to bear in mind, especially from a social standpoint. There are many groups which were just marginalized, like in agriculture, there is a shift of that, and just some people, really over 500,000 or 700,000 were just victims of very direct victims of that. New structure of our import-export policy and low inflation right now is a little bit different. But this is something that's after transformation. We might say, are we successful? Definitely yes. And we prepared. It has been 30 years since the transformation, but we have right now very good scientists and the people prepared, living in a completely new system. So when I talk to my students, they cannot believe how it was 30 years ago. And this is one of the biggest and the best achievement of our transformation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the presentation. The next 2 speakers will have pre-recorded their presentation. So the organizers will play the pre-recorded presentation. Then after that, we will have the question and answer session with the audience.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Shin-Gyu Kim. I'm a senior researcher at East European and Balkan Institute, Hankuk University of Foreign Studies. Today, I will talk to you about an analysis of economic and social factors of the Velvet Revolution and Czechoslovakia. Now I'll begin by an introduction. The purpose of this presentation is to answer following three questions about the Belgian Revolution in Czechoslovakia. First, for what reason liberalization and democratization had not proceeded step by step, but proceeded simultaneously? Second, why did the communist regime, which maintained coercive control, but managed to keep much better standard of living than neighboring communist countries, do not suppress anti-communist movements by force? And last, can the Belgian Revolution be defined as a revolution in classical sense? If so, what are main features of the Belgian Revolution in 1989 in Czechoslovakia? To answer these questions, I will divide my talk into three sections. In the second section, I will go over a brief historical background of the Belgian Revolution in December 17, 1989, and explain why the revolution began on that day. In the third section, I will look for essential factors that led to the outbreak of the Belgian Revolution in the viewpoint of economic aspect. Despite of existing researches, I will emphasize that economic factors were not enough to explain the causes of the Belgian Revolution in 1989. In the fourth section, I will find out the real cause of the revolution in the viewpoint of social aspect, and emphasize that the legacy of democracy, liberalism, individualism, and pluralism during the interwar period were important motives for moving away from the communist system. As Václav Havel had already suggested in his essay, The Power of the Powerless, deciding to live in truth was a starting point for bringing down the communist regime. Finally, I will explain which factors exerted more influence on the revolution than others. Then, let's talk about the process of Belgian Revolution. Liberalization and democratization in Czechoslovakia began much later than in other neighboring countries, such as Hungary and Poland, because of the coercive rule of the communist regime. During the communist rule, the position of reformists in the Communist Party of the Czechoslovakia was weak. And since the coercive rule of the communists, civil society was not be allowed to act as an independent society, and dissident movements even couldn't exist. And at the same time, there was a lack of linkage between the general public and students, dissident movements, and intellectuals. These were factors behind the belated start of liberalization and democratization. The most important reason why there was no reformist in Communist Party and the civil society was too weak was due to the normalization of Husak's regime, which took over the power since Prague Spring Reform was completely eliminated after 1969. In this situation, as Mikhail Gorbachev conducted perestroika and glasnost in the Soviet Union, since he became the first secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union in 1989, there were fierce debates over whether to follow such reforms and opening policies among in Czechoslovakia. At the time, Mr. Gorbachev declared he would not intervene in internal affairs of Eastern European countries. Then, through so-called Sinatra Doctrine or My Way Doctrine, settled states were allowed to pursue market-oriented economic reform. But confrontation of reform broke out in communists, and the hardliner Gustav Husak stepped down from the first secretary of the Communist Party, However, communists adhere to normalization policy and hesitate to reform. But even at that time, intellectuals and workers did not reject socialism itself, nor did also they think of a revolution to overthrow the communist regime. Moreover, the communists stubbornly rejected compromise and even talked with the opposition. Accidentally, an incident occurred that changed all that. It was a protest on November 17, 1989. Ceremony of the 60th anniversary of Jan Oplenter's death was beginning of the Velvet Revolution. About 1,500 students protested peacefully, and general public also joined them. They shouted politically sensitive slogans such as a free election and abolition of the communist dictatorship. They marched toward Prague Castle, where the present office was located, and the Wenceslas Square, where Communist Party's headquarters is located. At that moment, brutal oppression of the riot police began. In that process, rumors began to circulate that the police fired and a student was killed. The following day, a student death was found to be a rumor, but protests and strikes did not dwindle but spread throughout the country. Students decided to hold a 2-hour general strike, and with this incident, solidarity and unity among students, workers, intellectuals had emerged. 2 days later, the Civic Forum in Czech Republic and Public Against Violence in Slovakia were formed to unite sporadic and decentralized protest into a single voice against the communists. As protests and strikes continued, the leadership of the Communist Party recognized that they already had lost their legitimacy to govern. The communists were forced to accept a roundtable talk with the Civic Forum and agreed to form a coalition with a majority of non-communists. On December 29, 1989, Václav Havel was elected as president, which was a special event finalized the Velvet Revolution. Now I will focus on the economic factors of the revolution. As we know that socialist economy had revealed several serious deficiencies. It was ignoring rationality and productivity improvement. It was focusing on expanding of the external economies of scale. It was maximizing labor and resources inputs. Consequently, there was a declining standard of living and increasing external debt. Despite of these flaws, Czechoslovakia maintained high economic performance and high standard of living among socialist countries. For example, in 1989, GDP per capita was much higher and external debts was much lower than other communist countries. An opinion poll conducted in December 1989 revealed that even during the last moments of the revolution, quite a few Czechoslovaks believed in the Czechoslovak way to socialism promised by the communists in February 1948. And also, until mid-December 1989, 45% of the respondents supported the socialist economy and 47% of the respondents supported a mixed economy, and only 3% of the respondents supported capitalism. In another opinion poll conducted in 2010, which was on causes of the revolution, respondents believed bad governance and no competent leadership of the communists was the most important cause of the Velvet Revolution. That was 23%. And the second was corruption and lack of ability of the communists, 18%. And the third was expectation for freedom and democracy of the general public, that was 17%. External effect was fourth, but economic reason, such as economic and social crisis, lagging behind the world, external debts, lack of goods, long queues in front of stores, the need for economic reforms was supported by only 3% of the respondents. And the last one was activities of the dissidents. It was supported by just only 2%. Now we have to find out real cause of the revolution in social factors. There were social factors behind the revolution. The most important one was solidarity and unity, which was formed among each sectors of society. And also workers turned their backs on the communist regime and joined the cause with intellectuals and students against the communists, which induced a deeply divided Czechoslovak society into unity with a single voice. At that very moment, the communists lost their legitimacy to govern and gave up powers without resisting. In fact, complaints against the regime had begun immediately after establishment of communist dictatorship in February 1948. The communists had attempted to alleviate such dissatisfaction by converting vigorous general public into obedient so-called Homo Sovieticus for more than 40 years. But after 40 years of communism, the Czechoslovaks decided to discard the Homo Sovieticus' living in force and regain living in truth. Therefore, I conclude the main cause of the Velvet Revolution in 1989 in Czechoslovakia was neither the external effects nor the economic factors, but the solidarity and unity of the general public and expectation of changes. Although there were no heroic leaders and no bloodshed crashes between revolutionary and counter-revolutionary forces, but I'm sure that the Velvet Revolution was a great revolution that changed the structure and institutions through changes in minds and behavior of each citizens. That's what I want to talk and share with you. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. Our final presenter is Dr. Seug Hong, who also has pre-recorded his paper.
Thank you so much for introducing me, Dr. I'm so pleased to join this conference, and I just hope my presentation will help deepen the discussion on the subject of this conference. In my presentation, I would like to discuss the origin, development, and influences of the political thought for freedom, democracy, and independence in Ukraine. Throughout this presentation, I would like to prove that Ukraine's independence in 1991 was not coincidence. It was the realization of political aspiration that have persisted since the time of the Ukrainian Cossack. In the process of disintegration of the Soviet Union, whether or not the Ukrainian Republic would leave the Union had a great impact on the fate of USSR. Then why did the Ukrainians demand the independence from the Soviet Union? Where and when did their political arguments begin? What historical background is behind their political demands? These questions were the motivation of my studies. The beginning of the disputed relationship between Ukraine and Russia dates back to the signing of the Treaty of Pereyaslav in 1654. To this treaty, Khmelnytsky signed an oath of unilateral allegiance to the Muscovite Tsar. In the first place, Khmelnytsky expected an oath from both sides. in Khmelnytsky's point of view, this treaty was the promise of a Muscovite to protect the Ukrainians from Poland and respect Ukrainians' rights and privilege in exchange for the Ukrainian people's pledge of loyalty to the Tsar. However, Muscovite's representative, Butolin, refused to swear in the name of the monarch, arguing that, unlike the Polish king, the Tsar was the absolute ruler and that swearing to his servant would reduce his dignity. Fearing of losing the Tsar's aid, Khmelnytsky accepted the condition without Tsar's oath. The interpretation of the Treaty of Pereyaslav, which later united the two countries together, became the subject of frequently controversy among scholars. The problem is complicated by the fact that the original document is lost and only inaccurate copies and translation remains. After the Treaty of Pereyaslav, many Cossack hetmans tried to revert to pre-treaty conditions and break the unequal relationship between Ukraine and Russia. One of them was Ivan Mazepa, who persuaded King Charles XII of Sweden to fight against Russia in Poltava. In this battle, aimed at liberation and independence from Russia, Mazepa and his Cossack army were defeated and had to flee to Vendry in Moldova. After Ivan Mazepa died there, Philip Orlik was elected to the new hetman. One of his greatest achievements is that he established the first constitution of Ukraine. Orlik's constitution emphasized the need to establish a liberal and democratic system. The constitution consists of 16 articles and deals with all aspects of Ukrainian life at the beginning of the 18th century. Especially Article 6 criticizes the case of illegal abuse of power in the past and explains that it is necessary to prevent the concentration of power systematically. It also suggested that the general officer, the general council, and general court be run separately. It also emphasizes that the election of a hetman and other higher ranking position must be made through fair elections. Orlik's constitution clearly opposes autocracy and emphasizes the separation of political power. The constitution addresses the necessity of dividing power into executive, legislative, and the judiciary, and especially explained that within the executive branch, hetman's staff should play a role in limiting his power. Judging from the fact that almost 40 years later, Montesquieu insisted on the separation of powers in his writing, The Spirit of Law, in 1740, we can see how democratic and advanced the Orlik's constitution was. Political claims such as autonomy and democracy in Orlik's constitution were revived by the national awakening of Ukrainian intellectuals influenced by Enlightenment and Romantic nationalism in the late 18th and early 19th century. Historia Russov, an important document of Ukrainian political thought, appeared in the late 18th or early 19th century. This document describes how Ukrainian history has developed from the past to 1769, focusing mostly on the periods of the Cossack. The underlying principle of Historia Russov is that each nation has a natural, moral, and historical right to an independent political development. The main theme of Historia Russov is the struggle of a Ukrainian nation against Russian or Polish domination. Ukrainian political thought took a step forward with the formation of the Kirill and Methodius Brotherhood in 1845. With the 12 intellectuals, including Mykola Kostomarov, Taras Shevchenko, and Panteleimon Kulish, This brotherhood envisioned national autonomy within a free and equal Slavic federation. In such a political system, Russia is not a dominant nation, but one of the Slavic nations with equal freedom and opportunity. Rather, the Brotherhood envisioned that Kiev would lead the free democratic federal system as the center of the entire Slavic federation. The Brotherhood aimed to abolish serfdom, spread public education, and realize basic liberal democratic principles such as freedom of speech, freedom of thought, and freedom of religion. The political ideas and goals of this brotherhood are well represented in Mykola Kostomorov's The Books of Genesis of the Ukrainian Nation. Mykola Kostomorov insisted that Ukraine will be an independent republic in the Slavic Union. In the second half of the 19th century, Volodymyr Antonovich made a fundamental contribution to the development of Ukrainian political thought. He was born in the Polish gentry or right bank Ukraine, but he rejected his Polish nationality and social class by criticizing and reflecting on the oppression of the Polish people against the Ukrainians. Antonovich insisted on anti-imperialism and anti-colonialism through his numerous books. He was also known as a populist historian who denied the role of the elite ruling class and represented the interest of the Ukrainian peasant. However, according to Bogdan Khalid, he was not an anti-statist. He postulated the possibility of the existence of a federal multinational state that would guarantee universal rights and defend the equality of its citizens and nations. For Antonovich and other Ukrainian populists, the idea of a wide-ranging democracy and social equality of the historical Ukrainian communes, like Hromada, served as a source of inspiration and guide for their activities as leaders of and participants in the Ukrainian national movement. Therefore, he is recognized as the founder of the national democratic conception in Ukrainian history. Mikhail Drahomanov, a disciple of Antonovich, made a big mark in the development of the history of Ukrainian political thought in the late 19th century. At the time when radical socialism and communism had an influence on Ukrainian political ideology, Drahomanov referred to himself as a socialist, taking a different position from other radical socialists and Marxists. He rejected Marxism, especially materialist interpretation of history, and insisted that Ukrainian socialism must be oriented toward the peasantry. His motivation for socialism was ethical and concerned for social justice, as well as unprivileged and exploited people. Drahomanov considered civil rights and free political institutions more important than class struggles. He also demanded gradual social reform rather than a radical socialist revolution, and believed that social reform must be done with the liberation of the oppressed nation. In his article, Draft Constitution for the Ukrainian Society in the Free Union, Drahomanov also proposed a constitutionalist system to replace the Romanov dynasty in Russia. He criticized Russia for what caused Ukraine to suffer, but did not insist that Ukraine be completely separated from Russia and developed it into an independent state. Rather, he seems to have turned Russia into a democratic constitutional system and sought to find Ukraine's autonomy within it. He even supported anarchism or autonomy under the influence of Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, a French socialist political thinker. So it seems that he preferred to turn Imperial Russia into a federal state made up of local autonomous governments. His views have affected many Ukrainian intellectuals, which slowed the climb for complete independence of Ukraine. Political thoughts and arguments for Ukraine's complete independence from Russia were presented in 1900 years by Mykola Mikhnovsky. He studied law at the University of Kiev. He was also a founding member of the Taras Shevchenko Brotherhood. At Shevchenko's anniversary in Poltava and Kharkiv in 1900, he addressed the need for independence of Ukraine. Later, his speech was printed in Lviv under the title Samostina Ukraina and became the political goal of the Ukrainian Revolutionary Party. On March 4, 1917, when the collapse of the Russian Empire was imminent and a revolutionary situation unfolded, Ukrainian intellectuals founded the All-Ukrainian Council named the Ukrainian Central Rada. Central Rada united all political, public, cultural, and professional organizations of Ukraine and directed the Ukrainian national movement. When the revolution broke out in October 1917, the Bolsheviks of Petrograd overthrew the Russian provisional government. Under the leadership of Lenin and Trotsky, the Bolsheviks gained control over most of Russia's territory except Ukraine. Ukraine's Central Rada remained neutral and critical of the Bolshevik coup. Central Rada's strategy was to maintain relations with the Bolsheviks. However, on November 20, 1917, Central Rada declared the creation of the Ukrainian National Republic. Through this declaration, the new General Secretariat of the Central Rada also guaranteed freedom of speech, press, religion, and assembly, announced a political amnesty, and decreed the socialization of the land. In addition, the declaration made it possible for workers to have control over the workplace and stated that production was controlled by the state and that minority people were guaranteed autonomy. However, the Bolsheviks, who were unable to recognize the establishment of the Ukrainian National Republic, went through a lengthy war with the Central Rada between 1917 and 1921. In 1710, the first constitution of the Cossacks was drafted by Orlik, advocating autonomy and democracy, and about 208 years later, Ukraine declared an independent state. The Ukrainian National Republic, which was born on January 25, 1918, was weakened through the ongoing civil war and war against the Bolshevik army. Eventually, on March 18, 1921, the Treaty of Riga between Poland and the Bolsheviks led to the dissolution of the Ukrainian National Republic. Although the Ukrainian National Republic was short-lived, Ukraine's hope, aspiration, and political claims for independence and freedom never disappeared and persisted throughout the Soviet period. Ukraine's independence in 1991 was no coincidence. It was the realization of the political aspiration that have persisted since the time of Ukrainian Cossack. Thank you so much for your listening. Thanks.
Thank you so much for the presentation. Now we have time for a few questions from any participating audience. Yeah. Anyone has a question for any of the presenters? Yes, please go ahead.
Thank you for your presentation, Dr. Dennis Hart. My name is Jae-hee and research intern from EEBI. I learned about land reform and early state legitimacy in the PRK. And I have a question. Unlike Russia and Eastern European countries, how they could carry out land reform without any bloodshed, which is the most important reason for this?
Please turn on your microphone. Dr. Hart, please turn on your microphone. Yes.
Yes. Thank you for your question. I appreciate it very much. It's a very good question because usually when you have land reform, you're taking a very important thing, land, and everybody needs land. And you're taking it from one group and giving it to another. Obviously, there's going to be a battle involved. Eastern Europe, many of the land reforms they went through were very bloody and contested. What happened in North Korea was a number of factors. First, in 1945, because of the Japanese occupation, the land ownership had been pushed to an extreme inequality. So all the peasants knew that one, the land was unequally distributed. They wanted to change that. Okay? Now, the people who did not want to change it and would fight were two groups. One, the Japanese. Two, the landlords. But what happened is, in 1945, the Japanese lost World War II. That's a very good thing. So the Japanese, instead of fighting to keep the land, they wanted to go home to Japan. So the Russians moved in and they just simply took all the Japanese, put them in boats, and put them back in Japan. Okay? So there's that. So who was left was the landlords. And they have two types. One, the landlords who were big landlords and collaborators. That's simple. Collaborators you put in jail, which they did. Or the other thing, which was different than Eastern Europe, is if you had land reform in Romania or Poland, everybody had to live in that country. In North Korea in 1946 and 47 and 48, people could run away to South Korea because the South Korean government still had many collaborators in there. So the North landlords ran away to the South. So you do not have to shoot them because they ran away. Very convenient, okay? They should say thank you to them all for doing that. The third group were the landlords who were not collaborators. There were some of them. And what the Korean Communist Party did was very good. They gave everybody ojongbo, 12.25 acres, okay, 5 jongbo of land. And the landlords, they could get land too. They didn't take everything. They kept some of the land, but they did something very interesting. They took the landlords and they moved them from one province to a different province. This way, the landlords were not there to fight for their land, one. And two, when they land into a new province, they were just another peasant. They weren't landlords anymore. All their history was erased. Okay? Now then, the thing to keep in mind also was the Korean Communist Party under Kim Il-sung was very egalitarian. And they had learned from the Chinese Revolution that peasants are your friend. So they went into North Korea. The Russians went into North Korea. And the Russians in Eastern Europe had to fight many people, like in Poland, who hated communism. In North Korea, the people wanted communism. They wanted a revolution because a revolution meant landlords, imperialism, and Japanese are out. So it was a very rare set of circumstances that allowed the land reform to take place, popular support, and the landlords, collaborators, and Japanese were relocated in other places. So those are the basic reasons of what took place there. North Korea was very lucky at that time.
Yes, convergence of a lot of factors.
Yes, but a big factor was this. The Russians were willing to control North Korea with a light hand. In Eastern Europe, they were very serious and used heavy control. The reason is simple. Germany had attacked Russia 2 times. Each time they attacked through Eastern Europe. So for the Russians, Eastern Europe was national security. They wanted to make sure nobody attacked them a third time. So the Russians controlled the governments and put their armies there to build a defense against Western attacks. In Korea, nobody was going to use North Korea to attack Moscow. So therefore, the Russian generals went in there and they were more laissez-faire. They were more open. As long as North Korea was communist, they were content. They didn't need to have a large army there for very long. And that's what happened.
Okay, thank you very much.
Mhm.
Is Dr. Hong present? Is he able to take a question? I think he signed off. Is Dr. Hong present?
He's not here.
He's not here. Okay, I'm sorry. So in that case, we are out of time anyway. So we will wrap up this panel at this point,
Okay.
and we will take a break, and you will reconvene at 4:20, 4시 20분 Korea time. Okay. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.